She handed him the last bowl of grits from her cupboard, not knowing the man she fed owned half the county. It was the summer the earth cracked open and the banks started circling. With her husband's crops dead and their savings gone, that single act of charity would rewrite her family's future in a way no one could have imagined. This is the story of Ilara and Thomas Vance, fighting to keep their 80 acres in the grip of the worst drought in 40 years. When a hollow-eyed man appeared at their door, they faced a choice that defines life in farm country: save yourself or share the little you have left. What they couldn't know was that the man carried a secret and a pen that would turn their world upside down. The rain stopped in early April. By June, the Vance farm was a museum of cracked earth and dying dreams. Thomas Vance had inherited these 80 acres from his father, who'd gotten them from his father, a chain of calloused hands stretching back to the Homestead Act. But the soil, once dark and generous, had turned to pale dust that rose in angry clouds with every hopeless pass of the tractor. Ilara kept a ledger in the kitchen drawer. She tracked every expense in neat columns: seed, fuel, the bank note. The numbers had bled red for 3 straight seasons. The last entry read, "Final notice, August 15. That date was 2 weeks away. The banker, a man named Gerald Croft, drove out once a month in his clean sedan. He'd stand on the porch, hat in hand, speaking of restructuring and hard choices. His eyes never met theirs. They lingered instead on the barn's solid timber and the fertile bottomland by the creek. Assets, not a home. The drought of 1934 was biblical, but this one, the summer of 2022, was a silent, modern suffocation. Satellite data showed a moisture deficit not seen in 40 years. The state declared an agricultural disaster area, which meant paperwork, not rescue. For Thomas, the true measure was the well. Each morning, he'd drop a stone and listen for the splash. The echo grew fainter, the wait longer. Ilara's generosity was not born of plenty, but of a memory. She'd been 8 years old during her family's own crash. She remembered the casserole left on their porch by a neighbor they barely knew, the anonymous envelope with grocery money. That thread of kindness had been the rope they'd climbed out on. She told Thomas, "We might lose the land, but we don't have to lose our decency." He'd nod, staring at his worn boots, his silence a language of its own. The morning the stranger arrived, the heat was a physical weight. Thomas was attempting to jury-rig a pump, his knuckles bloody. Ilara was in the kitchen, dividing the last sack of cornmeal. She saw him first, a figure shimmering at the end of their long driveway, moving slow as a mirage. He was an older man, maybe 60, dressed in denim worn to a pale blue. He carried no bag. His face was etched with deep lines, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone in pain or profound exhaustion. He stopped at the property line, as if waiting for permission. Thomas saw him and straightened up, a defensive hand shielding his eyes. Strangers were rare, drifters looking for work maybe, though there was no work to give. This man didn't look like he was asking for a job. "Afternoon," Thomas called out, his voice flat. The man nodded. "I've been walking a long time," he said, his voice raspy. "I wondered if I might trouble you for a drink of water." It was the oldest, most basic request in a dry land. To refuse, it was a kind of sin. Ilara appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the man's cracked lips, the dust caked in the wrinkles of his neck. She saw the hollow look in his eyes, not desperation, but a deep, resigned weariness. "Come on up to the house," she said, before Thomas could speak. They gave him water from their kitchen pitcher. He drank it slowly, savoring each sip, his eyes closed. He didn't give a name. He just said he was passing through, but as he handed the glass back, his gaze drifted past Ilara to the sparse kitchen. He saw the single pot on the stove, the bare shelves. "You're in the thick of it too," he stated, not asking. Thomas grunted, "Aren't we all?" The man was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a quiet shame that made Ilara's heart ache, he spoke again. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. This was the calculus of the crisis. A drink of water was one thing, food was currency. The cornmeal on the counter was dinner and tomorrow's breakfast. Ilara followed her husband's gaze to the empty fields, then back to the stranger's trembling hands. The memory of that casserole on her childhood porch flashed bright and urgent. She walked to the stove without a word. She poured the last of the cornmeal into the pot, added water from their precious reserve, and stirred it over the flame. The scent of simple porridge filled the hot kitchen. She scooped the entire portion, thick, pale, and steaming, into a chipped bowl and placed it on the table in front of the stranger with a spoon. "It's plain," she said, her voice soft. The man stared at the food as if it were a vision. He looked from the bowl to Ilara's tired, kind face, and his eyes glistened. He ate slowly, methodically, cleaning the bowl until it shone. When he finished, he placed the spoon down with a final click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with more than gratitude. "This kindness, I will not forget it." He stood a little unsteady and nodded to Thomas, then to Ilara. He turned and walked back down the driveway, melting into the haze of the afternoon. Thomas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. They stood together on the porch, watching the empty lane, the weight of their own empty future settling back upon them. They had just given away their last meal to a man they would never see again. But the stranger had lied about one thing: he wasn't just passing through. And the document, carefully folded and sealed in the inner pocket of his dusty coat, was not for him. It was for them. He just needed to be sure they were the right people before he signed away a fortune. The days after the stranger left were the darkest yet. The silence felt like a verdict. Thomas and Ilara ate thin soup made from the last jar of canned tomatoes, the ghost of that cornmeal porridge haunting every spoonful. The banker, Gerald Croft, called. His voice on the crackling line was stripped of its polite veneer. The auction date was set for the third Tuesday in August. He was calling, he said, as a courtesy, to give them time to prepare. But what does a person prepare for when the only life they've known is about to be sold to the highest bidder? Thomas walked the fence lines, his hand brushing the rusted wire as if memorizing the pulse of his own skin. Ilara packed a single box of photographs and her grandmother's Bible. Everything else, the furniture, the tools, the very walls, belonged to the bank. A week passed. The heat broke slightly, replaced by a thick, ominous humidity that promised a storm but delivered nothing. On a Thursday morning, a different vehicle turned down their driveway. It was Croft's sedan. It was a sturdy, unmarked pickup truck, dusty from back roads. It stopped in the same spot the stranger had. A woman in her 50s stepped out. She wore practical boots and carried a leather folio. Her expression was professional, but her eyes were sharp, taking in the dying farm, the patched roof, the determined slump of Thomas's shoulders as he approached. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, my name is Helen Grave. I'm an attorney from Sutton County." Thomas's heart sank. A lawyer could only mean more trouble. Faster eviction, maybe. He crossed his arms. "We're not buying anything, and we sure can't pay for a lawyer." Helen Grave offered a small, understanding smile. "I'm not here to charge you. I'm here as a representative. My client has asked me to deliver something to you." Ilara, who had come to stand in the doorway, felt a cold trickle of apprehension. "Your client?" "The gentleman who visited you for a meal about 10 days ago." Helen opened the folio and extracted a long, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a blob of dark red wax. "He instructed me to give this to you personally and only after verifying your identity." He was quite specific. Thomas took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. His name and Ilara's were written on the front in a precise, elegant script. He broke the seal with a dirty thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet of the same fine paper. It was a letter. "To Thomas and Ilara Vance *. You fed a hungry man with your last provision. You asked for nothing in return, not even a name. In a world that measures everything, you gave without measure. Enclosed is the deed to 200 acres of bottomland along Cedar Creek, parcel 9 of the old Holloway estate. The title is clear. It is signed over to you, free and clear of all debt, effective upon your signing the acceptance attached. The land is good, the water table is deep, it will sustain you. Do not seek me out, this is not a debt repaid, but a kindness acknowledged. Tend the land, be well. Yours *. A grateful man *. For a full minute, neither of them moved or breathed. The words swam on the page. Thomas's hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled. Ilara reached out and steadied his wrist, her own eyes wide with disbelief. This is a joke, Thomas whispered, the sound torn from his throat. A cruel joke. Helen Grave, the attorney, remained patiently silent. Then she spoke, her voice low and steady. It is not a joke, Mr. Vance. I have verified the title history myself. The Holloway Creek parcel has been held in a blind trust for decades. My client is the sole beneficiary and grantor. He has the absolute legal right to transfer it. All the accompanying paperwork is here. She tapped her folio. Surveys, water rights, tax statements paid in full for the next 5 years. Ilara found her voice first. Why would he do this? The lawyer's professional mask softened just a fraction. He told me a story. He said he'd been walking for a long time, carrying that deed, looking for the right people. He said he'd visited every struggling farm in 3 counties. At some, he was turned away with a curse. At others, he was offered a meal, but only after a lecture on hard work or a prayer meant to save his soul. He said, you just saw a man who was hungry. You didn't see a test. You just saw a person. The world tilted on its axis. That silent, weary man hadn't been a beggar. He'd been a king in disguise, holding a kingdom in his pocket, searching for worthy heirs. The last bowl of grits hadn't been a sacrifice, it had been an unwitting audition, and they had passed. But Thomas, a man forged in hardship, felt suspicion rise like a bitter tide. What's the catch? There's always a catch. Is the land poisoned? Is it swampland? Is this some tax scheme? Helen Grave nodded, as if she'd expected this. A reasonable question. The catch, Mr. Vance, is that you must accept it. You must sign the papers, and in doing so, you will become the owners of some of the most fertile land in this state. I have the soil reports. I have the aerial photos. You are welcome to see the property today. I will drive you. The offer hung in the heavy air. Hope, after being strangled for so long, is a terrifying thing to resurrect. It hurts more than despair. They rode in silence in the lawyer's truck, down roads that turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. They passed their own dying fields, then crossed an old stone bridge over a creek that was, miraculously, still running with clear, swift water. And then they saw it. The 200 acres unfolded before them like a promise from a forgotten god. Tall green grass waved in the breeze. Stands of oak and hickory dotted the rolling hills. The bottomland by the creek was dark, rich, and visibly moist. A sturdy, if old, farmhouse and a barn stood sentinel on a rise. It was everything their farm was not. It was life, abundant and waiting. Thomas got out of the truck and walked into that green field. He sank to his knees, grabbed 2 fistfuls of the black earth, and brought them to his face. He wept, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Ilara stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, tears streaming down her own face, not making a sound. The lawyer watched from a respectful distance. She had seen reactions to unexpected fortune before, joy, greed, disbelief. But this raw, unadulterated grief for all the lost years, this reverence for the soil itself, was something different. Back at their kitchen table that evening, surrounded by the evidence of their poverty, the deed and the transfer papers looked like artifacts from another universe. Helen Grave explained each document. The signature line for the grantor was already signed with a flowing, unfamiliar name, Alastair Finch. Who is he? Ilara asked, tracing the name with her finger. A very private man, Helen replied carefully. A man who believes actions define a person more than words. He wishes to remain anonymous. The law allows for this in a private transfer. Your obligation is to him, not his name. Thomas picked up the pen. It hovered over the line where he and Ilara were to sign as grantees. This was the threshold. On this side was debt, failure, and the shame of the auction block. On the other side was a future, but it was a future built on a mystery, gifted by a ghost. If we sign this, Thomas said, his voice rough, what happens to our debt here, to Croft and the bank? Helen Grave allowed a thin, sharp smile. Once this transfer is recorded at the county courthouse, which I will do first thing tomorrow, you are the owners of valuable, unencumbered property. You can sell this current parcel to the bank to satisfy your debt, likely for more than you owe, given the development value. Or you can keep it and use the new land's equity to secure a loan to pay Croft off. The power, Mr. Vance, shifts to you. The pen touched the paper. Thomas signed his name, Ilara signed hers. The ink was dark and final. Helen Grave gathered the documents, placed them carefully in her folio, and stood. "Congratulations. I'll file these in the morning. You should expect a visit from Mr. Croft when the news reaches him. I would advise you not to be at home." She left them in the gathering twilight, the rumble of her truck fading away. They sat at their table, holding hands, staring at the empty envelope. They were rich, they were saved, and they had no idea who to thank. The storm, when it broke, came not from the sky, but from town. News in a rural county travels through the soil itself. By noon the next day, Gerald Croft's sedan came speeding up the driveway, kicking up a plume of dust. He didn't bother with polite steps. He marched to the porch, his face a thundercloud. "What in God's name is this I'm hearing, Thomas?" he demanded, waving a piece of paper, a notice from the county recorder's office. "You're on the title for Holloway Creek. How? That land, been locked up for 30 years. Thomas, for the first time in years, met the banker's gaze without flinching. He felt the solid weight of the new deed, a copy left with them by Helen Grave, in his back pocket. It was a gift, Gerald. "A gift," Croft spat the word. "Nobody gifts 200 prime acres. That land is worth over $2 million. Who gave it to you? Some relative you've been hiding." "A stranger," Ilara said quietly, coming to stand beside her husband. Croft stared at them, his financial mind unable to compute such an illogical transaction. His anger curdled into something colder, more calculating. This upset his books. This meant the Vances weren't destitute anymore. They were potential competitors, landowners with leverage. And the debt on this 80 acres was now a trivial line item against their new wealth. "I see," he said, smoothing his tie. "Well, this changes things, of course. We can restructure your note immediately, extend the terms. There's no need for unpleasantness." "We'll be paying off the note in full," Thomas said, the words tasting sweet as cool water. "Next week." Croft's smile was thin and brittle. "Of course. Well, congratulations." He turned and walked back to his car, but the look he shot over his shoulder was not one of defeat. It was one of reassessment. In his world, a windfall for someone else was always, somehow, a loss for him. The victory should have been pure, but a shadow had been cast. The mystery of Alastair Finch was now public knowledge, and in a small community, mystery is a vacuum that gossip and speculation rush to fill. At the general store, opinions flew. Old man Jepson said Finch was a crazy hermit who'd struck oil decades ago. Maggie Lane at the post office whispered he was a fugitive, buying a clean conscience. The most persistent and most dangerous theory came from the barstools at the town tavern. Alastair Finch didn't exist. The Vances had somehow stumbled upon a lost deed, a flaw in the old Holloway estate records, and were committing a sophisticated fraud. This last rumor, fueled by jealousy and Croft's discreet murmurs to his influential friends, reached the ears of someone with the power to act. 1 week after they signed the papers, a certified letter arrived from the Sutton County Clerk's office. It was a formal notice of a title challenge. The claimant was not Gerald Croft, but a corporate entity no one had ever heard of, Midland Agricultural Holdings, LLC. The letter stated that Midland held a previously unrecorded lien on the Holloway Creek parcel, dating back to a business loan made to the original owner in the 1970s. They were disputing the transfer to the Vances and filing an injunction to freeze the property until the matter could be settled in court. Thomas read the legalese, the words blurring into a familiar, terrifying pattern. It was happening again. The ground was crumbling beneath them just as they'd stepped onto it. Ilara called Helen Grave. The lawyer's voice was calm but grave. "This is a tactic, a delay tactic. These lost lien challenges are common when valuable property changes hands unexpectedly. Midland Agricultural is a shell company. I'll dig into who's behind it. But for now, the land is in legal limbo. You can't sell it, you can't borrow against it, and you can't stop the auction on your current farm next week." "So we lose everything anyway?" Ilara asked, her voice hollow. "Not necessarily," Helen said, "but we need to fight. And to fight, I need to find Alastair Finch. The challenge claims he had no right to transfer the land because of this old debt. Only he can prove the chain of title is clean. His anonymity is now your biggest vulnerability. The grateful stranger had vanished. Their rescuer had become a ghost whose disappearance might doom them. The gift had been a lifeline, but someone was trying to turn it into an anchor. And as Thomas hung up the phone, he realized the true lesson of their sudden fortune. In the world of land and money, no good deed goes unpunished for long. The battle for their future was no longer against the weather or the bank. It was against a hidden enemy they couldn't even name. Helen Grave began her search in the only place that made sense, the dust. The Sutton County Courthouse basement was a catacomb of leather-bound ledgers and fading microfilm. The history of the Holloway Creek parcel was a patchwork. Originally granted as part of a Spanish land grant in the 1800s, bought by timber baron Josiah Holloway in 1903, then passed down through a series of heirs who mostly neglected it. The trail for Alastair Finch was colder. She found the transfer into the Blind Trust, dated March 15, 1987. The grantor was listed as the Finch Family Trust. The trustee was a law firm in Atlanta that had dissolved in the 90s. It was a dead end crafted by professionals. Meanwhile, the clock ticked. The auction for the Vance's original farm was 5 days away. Thomas and Ilara existed in a state of suspended animation. The new land was a mirage they couldn't touch. Their old home was a corpse awaiting burial. The community's initial awe had curdled. Now, when Ilara went into town for supplies, she felt the stares, heard the conversations stop when she entered the store. The story of the generous stranger had been replaced by a juicier one, the scheming Vances and their forged deed. Helen, working late in her office, turned her attention to Midland Agricultural Holdings. Corporate registrations are public record. Midland was a Delaware LLC, a favorite for anonymity, but every company has a registered agent. For Midland, it was a corporate service company in Wilmington. She paid for a Rush Records request. When the documents arrived via fax, the name listed as the LLC's manager was a revelation. It was a law firm. The same law firm that represented Gerald Croft's bank. It wasn't proof, but it was a scent. Croft wasn't just a disapproving banker, he was actively trying to steal their gift. The lost Leon was a fiction, a weapon. She drove out to the Vance farm that evening. Thomas was packing the porch like a caged animal. Ilara looked exhausted, her kindness worn thin by fear. Helen laid out her discovery. Croft is behind Midland. He's using this challenge to freeze your assets so you can't pay him. He wants you to default, lose this farm at auction, and be so tied up in court over the new land that he can swoop in and make a deal to resolve the title issue by taking control of it himself. Thomas's face darkened with a rage Helen hadn't seen before. So he gets both. He gets everything. Unless we find Alastair Finch, Helen said. He's the only one who can short-circuit this. He can testify to the clean title. He can explain the trust. His word, as the grantor, trumps a fabricated Leon from 50 years ago. But you can't find him, Ilara stated flatly. I've hit a wall on paper, Helen admitted. So we think like him. He's an old man who walked your county for weeks, visiting farms. He didn't fly in. He doesn't live far. He's local or was once. He knows this land. She looked at them. Did he say anything else? Anything at all? A turn of phrase, a reference. Ilara closed her eyes, replaying that hot afternoon. The man drinking water. His quiet dignity. His hands. She opened her eyes. His hands, they were clean. I mean, they were dusty from the road, but his nails, they were trimmed. Even, they weren't a laborer's hands. They were careful hands. Thomas snapped his fingers. The way he ate, slow, precise, like every bite was important, not like a starving man, like a man who was used to ceremony. An idea, fragile as a spiderweb, formed in Helen's mind. A man of precision, a man who values ceremony and anonymity and has the wealth to give away a fortune. She stood up abruptly. I need to make a call. The call was to an old law school friend who worked at the State Historical Society. Helen asked a strange question. Were there any records, any old society pages or newspaper clippings about a family named Finch in the Sutton County area, particularly around the mid-century? A family of means, possibly with a son named Alastair. 2 hours later, her friend called back, her voice buzzing with excitement. She'd found it. In the society pages of the Sutton Sentinel from June 7, 1958. a photo of a charity gala for the county hospital. Among the listed attendees, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Finch and their son, Alastair. The caption noted Charles Finch was a prominent cardiac surgeon from Atlanta, summering at the family lodge on Cedar Creek. Cedar Creek, the same creek that ran through the 200 acres. The Finch family hadn't just owned land, they'd had a home there, a lodge. Helen searched property records for any structure on the parcel. The current survey only showed the old farmhouse and barn, but a Sanborn fire insurance map from 1965 showed a third structure deeper in the woods near the creek, labeled Finch Lodge. The next morning, Helen, Thomas, and Elara drove to the new land. They bypassed the open fields and followed a deer trail into the dense woodland along the creek. The air grew cool and damp. Mosquitoes buzzed, and then they saw it. Through a tangle of wisteria and young oak trees, the outline of a chimney. As they pushed closer, a structure emerged from the green embrace of the forest. Finch Lodge wasn't a lodge. It was an elegant, though now crumbling, mid-century modern cabin. Large windows were broken. The flat roof sagged, but it was unmistakably the retreat of someone with wealth and taste. And on the moss-covered front step, sitting neatly on a folded piece of oilcloth as if placed there yesterday, was a ceramic bowl. It was the exact same chipped pattern as the bowl Elara had served the cornmeal in. Elara gasped. Thomas reached for her hand. Helen stepped forward, her heart pounding. The door was unlocked. They stepped into the dim, musty interior. The cabin was a time capsule, fine mold-spotted furniture, books on shelves, their spines cracked, and on a large drafting table by the biggest window, illuminated by a shaft of dusty light, lay architectural drawings, not of buildings but of gardens, intricate, beautiful designs for water features, perennial beds, and arbors. Each was signed in the same precise script as the deed, A. Finch. Alastair Finch wasn't just a rich hermit, he was a landscape architect, an artist. In a small bedroom, they found more photographs in simple frames. A young, smiling Alastair with an older couple, his parents, a diploma from an elite university, and a wedding photo. Alastair, handsome and beaming, next to a radiant woman with dark hair. The photo was dated 1972. The last picture on the dresser told the tragic story. It was Alastair, older, his face etched with grief, standing alone in a beautiful, overgrown garden. The woman was gone. Helen picked up a book from the nightstand. It was a volume of poetry. A faded newspaper clipping fell out. It was an obituary from 1986. Elena Finch, beloved wife of Alastair Finch, lost after a long illness. It noted she was an avid gardener. The final line read, "She found God in every leaf." Elena Finch had died, and shortly after, in 1987, Alastair had placed the land in a blind trust and vanished from public life. The gift of land wasn't just a reward for kindness. It was a tribute to a lost love, a legacy he no longer wanted to bear alone. But he was still here. He had to be. The clean bowl on the step was a message. He knew they would come. As they stood in the silent cabin, absorbing this history of love and loss, a sound made them turn, a soft footfall on the porch. There, framed in the doorway, was the stranger, Alastair Finch. He was cleaner now, dressed in simple khakis and a worn linen shirt. His eyes, that had seemed hollow with weariness, now held a deep, oceanic sadness and a glimmer of peace. "You found the garden," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It was Elena's masterpiece. I've been tending it poorly, I'm afraid." For a moment, no one spoke. Elara found her voice first. "Mr. Finch, thank you for the land, for everything." He shook his head slowly. "No, thank you. You gave a tired old man a meal when you had none. You saw a person, not a problem. In the last year, I have visited 47 farms. I heard every reason why people were struggling. I heard blame placed on the government, the weather, the banks. I heard pride refuse help and desperation curse it. You simply saw hunger and answered it. You have the heart this land needs." Thomas stepped forward. "Sir, we have a problem. The land, there's a legal challenge. A company called Midland is saying there's an old lien." A shadow passed over Alastair's face. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition, followed by cold anger. "Midland," he repeated, "that would be Gerald." Helen blinked. Gerald Croft." Alastair Finch nodded, a weary sag in his shoulders. Gerald Croft was my father's banker, and for a time mine. After Alina died, I was not myself. I let things slide. Gerald managed some family assets. He always had an appetite for what wasn't his. When I transferred the land to the trust, I removed it from his reach. He was furious. He claimed I owed fees, invented expenses. I paid him to go away. I should have known he'd keep the paperwork. The puzzle pieces slammed together. Croft's aggression wasn't just about the Vances' debt. It was a decades-old grudge. He'd been waiting, nursing a grievance against the elusive Finch, and the moment the land resurfaced, he attacked, using the Vances as the pressure point. "Will you help us?" Helen asked. "Will you come to court and testify? He's using a shell company to hide. Your testimony breaks it." Alistair looked past them, out the broken window to the wild garden. He was silent for a long time, a man who had chosen the company of trees over people. Then he looked at Thomas and Ilara, seeing the fear and hope warring in their eyes. He saw the ghosts of his own past, the struggle, the love for the soil, the devastating loss. "Yes," he said finally, "I will help you. It is time I came out of the woods." They drove back to town, Alistair Finch in the cab of Helen's truck, staring at the changing landscape of his childhood with the eyes of a ghost returned. Helen immediately filed a motion to dissolve the injunction, attaching a sworn affidavit from Finch, attesting to the clean title and naming Gerald Croft as the malicious force behind Midland Agricultural. The legal shockwave was immediate. A hearing was set for the day before the farm auction. The night before the hearing, Gerald Croft made his move. It wasn't legal, it was desperate. Someone threw a brick through the front window of Helen Graves' office. A note was tied to it with twine. It read, "Drop it, or the fire next time." Helen wasn't intimidated, she was enraged. She called the sheriff, a man who'd gone to school with Thomas. She also called a reporter at the regional paper. The story was no longer just about a land dispute. It was about corruption, intimidation, and a banker willing to break the law to get what he wanted. The hearing was packed. Farmers from 3 counties filled the wooden benches of the Sutton County courtroom. They'd heard the story, the mysterious gift, the banker's scheme, the return of the long-lost Alistair Finch. This was the best drama the county had seen in years. Gerald Croft sat at the defendant's table with a slick city lawyer. He looked composed, but his eyes darted nervously as Alistair Finch walked in, led by Helen Grave. Finch wore a simple, clean suit. He carried an air of undeniable, weathered authority. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called the hearing to order. Croft's lawyer argued the lien was valid, the transfer suspect. Then Helen called Alistair Finch to the stand. Under oath, Alistair told his story, the inheritance, the love for his wife and the land they cherished, her death, his retreat, his decision to find worthy stewards for Alina's legacy, his methodical search, and his clear, unequivocal statement that there had never, ever been a lien to any entity called Midland Agricultural. Then Helen played her final card. She entered into evidence the corporate records showing Midland's connection to Croft's law firm. She described the brick through her window, and then she called a surprise witness, the retired records clerk from Croft's bank, a woman Helen had tracked down, who testified that Croft had asked her to look for any old paperwork on the Holloway land months before the Vances got the deed. Croft's facade crumbled. The judge didn't even wait for closing arguments. She dismissed the title challenge with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. She dissolved the injunction, and then, fixing Croft with a gimlet stare, she referred the matter of the fraudulent lien and witness intimidation to the State Attorney General's office for possible criminal prosecution. The gavel fell, it was over. Outside the courthouse, in the blazing afternoon sun, Thomas and Ilara embraced, tears of relief streaming freely. The crowd of farmers erupted in cheers and applause. They had witnessed one of their own beat the machine. Alistair Finch stood apart, watching. A small, sad smile touched his lips. Helen approached him. "You saved them," she said. "No," he replied, watching as Ilara shook the hand of a neighboring farmer who'd once gossiped about her. "They saved themselves. I just opened the gate." He turned to Helen. "The lodge, I'd like to sign it over to them as well. The garden, it should have life in it again." As the celebration swirled around them, Thomas caught sight of Gerald Croft slipping out a side door of the courthouse, alone, his head down, his world of petty power collapsing. The auction for their old farm was tomorrow, but now they had the means and the clear title to stop it. Yet as the sun began to set, painting the sky in triumphant oranges and purples, a single, unresolved thread pulled tight in Thomas's mind. They had won the battle, but Alastair Finch's return to the world and the very public humiliation of a powerful man like Croft felt like the end of one story and the dangerous beginning of another. The gift had been given and defended, but the consequences of accepting it were still unfolding, and the most perilous chapter was yet to come. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn in the air. At the Sutton County Courthouse steps, a crowd gathered, not the predatory investors Gerald Croft had hoped for, but neighbors. Farmers from across the valley stood in silent solidarity. They'd heard the full story. They knew the Vances had their land, but they also knew a principle was at stake. A family shouldn't be erased over one bad season. Thomas and Ilara arrived with Helen Grave and Alastair Finch. They did not take a place in the crowd. They walked directly to the auctioneer, a man named Roy who'd known Thomas's father. Thomas handed him a cashier's check, drawn against a loan secured by the new Holloway Creek land. It was for the full amount owed to the bank, plus penalties. Roy examined it, nodded once, and turned to the crowd. "The debt is satisfied," he announced, his voice carrying across the square. "There will be no auction today." A collective sigh, then a ripple of applause moved through the crowd. The Vances' 80 acres were free and clear. They owned 2 properties now, but as they turned to leave, Ilara tugged Thomas's sleeve. She whispered in his ear. He listened, his expression shifting from relief to resolve, then nodded. Thomas turned back to the crowd. He cleared his throat. "This land, it's been in my family for generations, but we can't work 2 farms, and we know there are others still on the brink." He looked at Ilara, who gave him an encouraging nod. "So we're putting 10 acres of our bottom land, the best 10, into a community trust. Any farmer who needs a season to get back on their feet can use it rent-free. We'll call it the Finch plot." The crowd was stunned into silence. Then an old farmer named Bud Carson took off his hat and held it over his heart. One by one, every other farmer followed. It was the highest honor they knew. Alastair Finch, standing apart, watched this. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his lined cheek. His gift had not just saved a family, it had created a seed. With the legal war over and their legacy secure, the hard, joyful work began. The Vances moved to the 200 acres. They decided to keep their old homestead, renting the house to a young farming couple starting out, charging a token rent of $1 a year. The Holloway Creek land was a paradise waiting for stewardship. With the first fall rains, the creek swelled and the water table rose. Thomas, with a crew of neighboring volunteers, began restoring the old farmhouse. Ilara turned her attention to the overgrown garden around Finch Lodge. Alastair had signed the lodge over to them, as promised, but he asked if he might stay on in the small caretaker's cabin nearby. He wanted to see the garden bloom again. He became Ilara's guide, slowly emerging from his shell of grief. He showed her Alina's notebooks, filled with observations about native plants and soil cycles. The garden, he explained, wasn't just ornamental. It was a living laboratory for drought-resistant perennials and companion planting, knowledge that was now priceless. Together, they began to clear the weeds, revealing the bones of Alina's masterpiece. One afternoon, while digging near a collapsed stone wall, Ilara's shovel struck something hard and metallic. She called Thomas and Alastair over. They carefully unearthed a small, rusted lockbox. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Alina Finch. The final entry was dated a week before her death. "My dearest Alastair, asterisk. If you are reading this, the cancer has won, and I am in the garden forever. Do not grieve in the shadows. This land is your heart, but it must not become your tomb. Give it to someone who will hear its song. Find people whose hands are rough but whose hearts are soft. Let our love feed more than just the memories. I planted a secret for you, my love. Where the 3 oaks form a cathedral, look to the stone that does not belong. It holds my last surprise for you." Alastair read the words aloud, his voice breaking. He had never found the journal. He'd been too lost in grief to look. They went to the stand of 3 massive white oaks, a place Alastair had avoided for 20 years. At their base was a ring of native stones. One, a smooth, grey river rock, was indeed out of place. They pried it up. Beneath it was a time capsule, a sealed glass canning jar. Inside were two things: a beautiful, antique emerald ring, Elena's engagement ring she'd said she lost years ago, and a deed of her own. It was a handwritten, notarized document, leaving her entire personal estate, including a separate portfolio of stocks and bonds she'd inherited from her family, to the future stewards of Holloway Creek, whoever they may be. She had kept it separate from Alastair's trust, a final, independent act of faith. The portfolio, managed quietly by a firm in Atlanta, had been compounding interest for 2 decades. Its value was now just over $1.2 million. The final surprise was not just wealth, it was Elena's voice from beyond, blessing the transfer and anointing the new owners. It was her saying, "This is right." Alastair insisted the money belonged to Thomas and Elara as Elena's stated heirs. They were overwhelmed. They used a portion to establish a permanent endowment for the community trust, ensuring the Finch plot would help farmers in perpetuity. They invested in solar irrigation for the new land and built a proper barn. As for Gerald Croft, the state attorney general's investigation moved swiftly. Facing charges of fraud, forgery, and witness intimidation, he cut a deal. He resigned from the bank, paid a significant fine, and left the state. The bank, under new management, issued a formal apology to the Vances and to Alastair Finch. The predator was gone. Years began to turn. The Vance family farm on Holloway Creek became a model of sustainable agriculture. Thomas and Elara had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up with dirt under their nails, and Alastair Finch as a beloved, if eccentric, honorary grandfather. He taught them the names of every plant and the stories in the stars. On the first day of spring, 5 years after the stranger came to their door, the entire community was invited to the garden at Finch Lodge. It was fully restored, a riot of color and scent. At the center, a simple bronze plaque was unveiled. It read, "For Elena, who believed kindness was the only seed that mattered, and for Alastair, who kept the ground fertile until it could be sown." Alastair, growing frail but radiant, stood between Thomas and Elara. He addressed the crowd, his voice soft but clear. "I spent years building walls against the world. I thought I was protecting a memory, but a memory needs air and light. It needs new hands to carry it forward. These hands," he said, taking Thomas's and Elara, "have given my past a future, and they have shown me that the greatest harvest is not what you take from the land, but what you leave in the hearts of others." The story of the meal for a deed became a local legend, a modern-day parable. It proved that in a world often ruled by scarcity and suspicion, the calculus of the heart could still yield a miraculous return. The Vances never became flashy or extravagant. They remained what they always were, farmers. But they were farmers with a mission, guardians of a gift that grew every time they passed it on. The drought eventually broke. The rains returned, but the lessons of that dry season remained etched in the valley's soul. It was a reminder that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to give away your last bowl of grits to a stranger. And sometimes that stranger is an angel in dusty denim, carrying a deed to a new beginning in his pocket. The chain of kindness, once started, is impossible to break. It flows like water under dry ground, waiting to spring up in the most unexpected places, turning deserts into gardens and strangers into family. This is where our story rests, but the seed is now in your hands. We walk through our days surrounded by potential turning points we never see. The person ahead of us in line, the stranger asking for directions, the quiet neighbor. We classify them quickly and move on, unaware that within ordinary moments sit the seeds of extraordinary change. The story of Thomas, Elara, and Alastair Finch asks us a dangerous, beautiful question. What if we stopped classifying and started seeing? We often believe that to change a life requires grand plans, vast resources, or dramatic interventions. We wait for our moment to be big, impressive, and safe. But the universe's arithmetic operates differently. It counts the quiet cup of water offered without judgment. It weighs the last portion of food shared without expectation. It values the humble act that says, "I see your need, and while I have little, what I have is yours." This is the true currency of human connection, and it holds a value that no bank can measure and no drought can wither. Alastair Finch wandered with a deed in his pocket, but what he truly carried was a broken heart seeking proof that the world still held the goodness his wife believed in. He wasn't testing people, he was hopping to find them. In a kitchen stripped bare by hardship, he found his answer. Not in a sermon, not in a transaction, but in a simple, quiet act of recognition. The miracle wasn't the 200 acres. The miracle was that, in their moment of greatest scarcity, Thomas and Alara's humanity remained abundant. This story is a map to a different kind of wealth. It shows that the walls we build for protection, whether of pride, suspicion, or grief, often become the cages that isolate us from our own redemption. Alastair hid in the woods. Thomas and Alara were cornered by debt. Gerald Croft was imprisoned by greed. Freedom came not from hoarding, but from giving, not from winning, but from connecting. So what does this mean for you right now? It means the next time you feel the impulse to help, but hear the voice of caution listing all the reasons not to, the scarcity, the risk, the possibility of being fooled, you might pause. You might remember that the most profound chapters of our lives often begin with a sentence we almost didn't speak, a door we almost didn't open, a small kindness we almost talked ourselves out of offering. You are surrounded by your own version of a dusty stranger. They might not arrive with a land deed. Their gift might be a lesson, a friendship, a warning, or simply the satisfaction of having lived up to your own ideals. The return on investment is not guaranteed in the terms we understand, but it is guaranteed to change you. It is guaranteed to weave you into the larger, invisible tapestry of human grace. Let this story be a reminder. When the ground is cracking beneath your feet and the well seems dry, sometimes the only way to bring the rain is to pour out the last of your water for someone else. The world is waiting for your version of a bowl of grits. What will you do with it? If this story touched a place in your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We live in a noisy world, but the quiet stories of courage and kindness are the ones that truly echo. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss our next journey into the human spirit. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your heart even more so.